He was the highest-paid actor in American television history. Not one of the highest paid. The highest paid. $1,800,000 for every single episode of a show where he played a version of himself so convincingly that audiences could not tell where the character ended and the man began. He starred alongside Michael Douglas in Wall Street. He stood in the mud and the fire of Oliver Stone's Platoon and helped that film win the Academy Award for Best Picture. His name was Charlie Sheen, and for a brief, extraordinary window of time, it seemed like he could survive anything. But behind that luminous legacy lies a story not glamorous, but devastating, in ways that Hollywood rarely allows its legends to tell out loud. Because the same man who earned those staggering fees, who stood on stages and accepted applause from millions, was quietly carrying a diagnosis he would not share with the world for 4 years. He was fighting a war that no camera crew filmed and no studio greenlit. He was losing, and then, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, he was not. There is a particular kind of strength that is forged not in triumph, but in the long, private years of putting yourself back together when the whole world has already written your obituary. Charlie Sheen is 60 years old. He is sober. He is still standing. If the story of Charlie Sheen has ever made you wonder what it actually costs to fall that far and still find your way back, leave a tribute in the comments for one of the most complicated legends in the history of Hollywood. It is sobering to realize that the beginning of this particular fall was marked not by failure, but by the most spectacular success imaginable. And that is where this story has to begin. In September of 2025, Charlie Sheen did something that very few people in his position have ever had the courage to do. He sat down in front of a camera, not to promote a film, not to announce a comeback, not to deflect or perform or charm his way through a prepared statement, but to tell the truth, or at least his version of it. He released a memoir called The Book of Sheen, and on September 10th of that same year, Netflix released a 2-part documentary called AKA Charlie Sheen, directed by Andrew Renzi, that walked through 7 family interventions, multiple divorces, a public meltdown that became a cultural phenomenon, and a medical diagnosis that changed everything. He turned 60 years old that month. He had been sober since December of 2017. The documentary was not universally praised. The Guardian wrote that Sheen appeared to show no genuine remorse for some of the most serious things he had done. Other critics argued that the film was too gentle, too willing to let the man sit in the glow of his own mythology without fully reckoning with the people he had hurt along the way. Those are fair observations. They are part of this story, too. But here is what is also true. Charlie Sheen showed up. At 60, after everything, after the firings and the settlements and the diagnoses, and the years that burned so hot and so fast they should have consumed him entirely, he sat down and said, "I am not calling all of this a comeback. I am calling it a reset." That word matters. A comeback implies a return to something that existed before. A reset implies the understanding that whatever came before is gone, and what remains is the question of what you choose to build in its place. For a man who spent the better part of a decade being the most watched, most mocked, most discussed celebrity in America, that is not a small thing to say. That is not a small thing to mean. This is his story. Carlos Erwin Estevez was born on the 3rd of September, 1965, in New York City. He was the 3rd child of Ramon Estevez, the man the world knew as Martin Sheen, and his wife Janet Templeton. The family was not wealthy. Martin Sheen was a working actor, talented and deeply committed to his craft. But the kind of stability that comes with genuine Hollywood success had not yet arrived. The Estevez household was shaped by discipline, by Catholic faith, and by the particular pressure that lives inside a home where the father is a man of enormous artistic ambition and the financial reality has not yet caught up with the dream. They moved to Malibu when Carlos was still young. And it was there, on the edges of Los Angeles, that he and his older brother Emilio began making films. Not dreaming about making films, actually making them, shooting on Super 8 cameras in the backyard and on the street, pulling in neighborhood friends who would themselves go on to become names. Rob Lowe was among them. Sean Penn was among them. There was something in that group, something restless and hungry and genuinely gifted, that the city of Los Angeles seemed to attract and then sharpen into something harder and more dangerous. Carlos dropped his surname when he began pursuing acting professionally. He became Charlie Sheen, taking the stage name from his father's adopted name rather than carrying the family name into a career that was entirely his own. It was a quiet declaration of independence wrapped inside an act of inheritance. He wanted to be his own thing. He also wanted to honor where he came from. That tension between the man he was born as and the man he was trying to become would follow him for the next 4 decades. The breakthrough came with Oliver Stone. In 1986, Stone cast Charlie Sheen in Platoon, a film about the Vietnam War that was shot in the Philippines under conditions that were, by every account, grueling and transformative. Sheen was 20 years old. He was surrounded by actors who would define a generation. Tom Berenger, Willem Dafoe, Forrest Whitaker, Johnny Depp, and he held the center. He played Chris Taylor, a young soldier trying to understand what war does to the men who fight it and what it does to the men who lead them. The performance was quiet and interior and deeply felt. It was not the performance of a young man showing off. It was the performance of a young man telling the truth. Platoon won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1987. It won Best Director for Oliver Stone. It was the film that made an entire generation look at the Vietnam War differently. And Charlie Sheen was its face and its conscience. Stone brought him back the same year for Wall Street. As Bud Fox, the young, ambitious stockbroker who falls under the corrupting spell of Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas in one of the defining performances of that decade, Sheen gave a performance of genuine complexity. He played a man who knew he was making the wrong choices and could not stop himself from making them. It was not difficult to watch that performance and believe that Charlie Sheen understood something about that particular kind of self-destruction from the inside. He was 21 years old. He had 2 of the most important films of the decade on his resume. The trajectory seemed not just promising, but inevitable. The kind of career that arrives fully formed and simply continues upward. What happened next was not inevitable. Nothing that happened next was inevitable. But it is also not entirely surprising, because the same qualities that made Charlie Sheen magnetic on screen, the appetite, the intensity, the refusal to modulate or contain himself, were qualities that do not stay neatly inside the boundaries of a film set. They go home with you. They sit across from you at dinner. They follow you into every room you enter for the rest of your life. The talent and the trouble were never separate things. They were always the same thing, pointed in different directions on different days. In 2003, Charlie Sheen signed on to star in a new CBS sitcom created by Chuck Lorre. The show was called 2.5 Men. The premise was simple. 2 brothers sharing a Malibu beach house, one of them a dissolute, charming, perpetually irresponsible jingle writer, the other a neurotic, recently divorced chiropractor raising his young son. Charlie Sheen would play the dissolute one. His character's name was Charlie Harper. It was not a stretch. That observation is not a criticism. It is, in fact, the secret to why the show worked so completely, and for so long. Charlie Sheen was not acting in the way that requires transformation or disguise. He was doing something rarer and, in some ways, more difficult. He was taking the most recognizable version of himself, the version the tabloids had been photographing and the gossip columns had been cataloging for years, and he was turning it into comedy. He was making it warm. He was making it watchable. He was making 30 million people every week feel like they were in on the joke with him, rather than simply watching from outside a velvet rope. John Cryer played Alan Harper, the neurotic brother. Angus T. Jones played Jake, the half-man of the title. The three of them built something that, by any metric that matters in American television, was extraordinary. 2.5 Men was the most watched comedy on American television for most of its run. It was the kind of show that people watched with their families, that played in hospital waiting rooms and hotel lobbies, that became a reliable, comfortable presence in the rhythm of ordinary American life. And Charlie Sheen was the reason people turned it on. By the later seasons, he was earning $1,800,000 per episode. That figure bears repeating not for shock value, but because it is the number that explains everything that came after. Both the extraordinary excess of his personal life during those years and the extraordinary violence of the fall when it arrived. At $1,800,000 per episode, you are not simply wealthy. You are insulated from consequence in ways that are genuinely dangerous for a human being who is already struggling with impulse and appetite and the particular kind of loneliness that lives inside enormous public success. His personal life during the 2.5 Men years was, by any measure, chaotic. He married the actress Denise Richards in 2002. They had 2 daughters together, Sam, born in 2004, and Lola, born in 2005. The marriage ended in divorce in 2006, in proceedings that were public and painful and legally complicated. He married Brooke Mueller in 2008. They had twin sons together, Bob and Max, born in 2009. That marriage ended in divorce in 2011, in circumstances that were even more public, even more painful, and significantly more legally complicated. Through all of it, the show continued. Through the marriages and the divorces and the tabloid headlines and the trips to rehabilitation facilities that were becoming, by the end of the 2000s, a pattern rather than an exception, through all of it, Charlie Sheen showed up on set, delivered his lines, earned his incomprehensible salary, and made 30 million people laugh every week. There is something both admirable and deeply troubling about that. Admirable, because the professional discipline required to maintain that level of performance while your personal life is disintegrating is not nothing. Troubling because it meant that the show became, for years, a container that held everything together long after the man inside it had stopped being able to hold himself together. The show was the structure. And when the structure finally cracked, when the distance between Charlie Harper and Charlie Sheen collapsed entirely, and there was no longer any useful fiction separating the character from the man performing him, what happened next happened fast, and it happened in front of everyone. In January of 2011, production on 2.5 Men was suspended. The official reason was that Charlie Sheen had checked himself into a rehabilitation facility. It was not the first time. It was not the second time. By this point, the trips to rehabilitation had become a rhythm of their own, a cycle of excess and intervention and temporary correction that had been repeating itself for years with diminishing returns and diminishing credibility. But this time, something was different. This time, when the show came back, Charlie Sheen did not come back with it. What followed was one of the most extraordinary public meltdowns in the history of American celebrity. And extraordinary is the correct word. Not because the behavior was admirable, but because the scale and the speed and the sheer unfiltered intensity of it had no real precedent. Charlie Sheen did not retreat. He did not go quiet. He did not issue a statement through a publicist and check into a facility and wait for the news cycle to move on. He went to war. He gave interviews to every outlet that would have him. He called Chuck Lorre a contaminated little maggot. He described himself as having tiger blood and Adonis DNA. He invented a vocabulary. Winning was the word that landed hardest, the word that became a cultural shorthand almost immediately, the word that people repeated back to each other with a mixture of mockery and something that was almost, uncomfortably, like recognition. He launched a live tour called The Torpedo of Truth. He stood on stages in front of thousands of people who had paid real money to watch a man in the middle of a very public unraveling, and he performed his own chaos for them like it was a show he had always meant to put on. He was fired from 2.5 Men in March of 2011. Chuck Lorre replaced him with Ashton Kutcher. The show continued for 4 more seasons without him. The Torpedo of Truth tour was a critical and commercial disaster. Audiences who had come expecting something, entertainment, confession, spectacle, anything coherent, left confused and underwhelmed. The vocabulary that had seemed electric on television interview sets felt hollow on a stage in front of a live crowd, waiting for a punchline that never arrived. And yet, there is something worth sitting with in all of this. Something that gets lost when the meltdown is reduced to its most quotable moments and its most embarrassing footage. The man standing on those stages saying winning was not performing happiness. He was not, in any meaningful sense, winning. He was a man who had just lost the most lucrative job in the history of American television, whose marriages had ended in public wreckage, whose relationships with his children were strained and complicated, whose body and mind were carrying years of accumulated damage that had not yet fully declared itself. What the winning moment actually was, what it looks like in retrospect, with the distance of 15 years, is a man in enormous pain performing the opposite of that pain at maximum volume because the alternative was silence, and silence was the one thing he could not survive at that particular moment. He later admitted, with the kind of honesty that only becomes possible once the noise has stopped, that the person standing on those stages was not someone in control. He said, "When I finally decided that I was going to make AA a place that I passed through and not wound up in, that is when I felt like I was the captain of my own ship." That sentence contains, in compressed form, everything the Torpedo of Truth tour could not say out loud. The captain of his own ship, which means that during those months in 2011, he was not the captain. The ship was moving at enormous speed in no particular direction, and everyone on the shore could see it. And the man at the wheel was the last one to understand what was actually happening. The world watched. The world laughed. The world shared the clips and repeated the catchphrases and bought tickets to the tour and generated an almost infinite quantity of content about a human being in the process of coming apart. And somewhere inside all of that noise, something else was happening. Something that Charlie Sheen was not telling anyone. Something that would not become public knowledge for another 4 years. And that, when it finally did become public, would reframe everything that had come before it in ways that were uncomfortable and necessary and deeply, genuinely human. What was he carrying during those years of winning and tiger blood? and torpedo of truth. What was the thing that sat underneath all of it? Invisible to the cameras, unspoken in the interviews, absent from every headline that the meltdown generated? That question has an answer, and the answer changes this story completely. On the 17th of November, 2015, Charlie Sheen sat down across from Matt Lauer on the Today Show and said 5 words that he had been carrying alone for approximately 4 years. I am, in fact, HIV positive. The studio was quiet in the way that studios rarely are. The kind of quiet that happens when something real enters a space that is designed, by its entire architecture and lighting and format, to keep reality at a comfortable distance. Charlie Sheen sat in that chair and said those 5 words, and the distance collapsed entirely. He had known since approximately 2011. Since the very period of the meltdown, the tour, the winning, the tiger blood, through all of it, he had been carrying a diagnosis that he described as the most upsetting and just devastating and life-altering moment that one could have. He said he had told a core group of people. He said the decision to go public had been made because he could no longer sustain the cost of keeping it private. Not emotionally, not financially, not in any way that left him intact. He said people he had trusted had been leaking the information to tabloids. He said he had paid enormous sums of money over the years in what he described as shakedowns, payments made to people who threatened to reveal his status if he did not comply. He told Lauer, "I was doing it to keep them quiet. And what people have to realize is that's just money going out the door with absolutely no return. The money, the settlements, the silence, 4 years of it, layered on top of everything else that was already visible, the firings, the divorces, the public chaos. There had been this other war running simultaneously, invisible to everyone outside a very small circle, consuming resources and attention and whatever remained of his capacity for trust." His physician, Dr. Robert Huizenga, appeared on camera and confirmed the diagnosis. He confirmed that Charlie Sheen was HIV positive but did not have AIDS. He confirmed that Sheen was on antiretroviral medication that kept his viral load at undetectable levels, which meant, in medical terms, that the virus was present but suppressed, that his immune system was functioning, and that with continued treatment, the prognosis was not the death sentence that the word HIV still carried in the public imagination for a generation that had watched the epidemic of the 1980s and early 90s take people they loved. Dr. Huizenga said, with the particular precision of a physician who understands that his patient has just said something irreversible in front of the entire country. The most pressing medical concerns are not the HIV itself, but the depression and the history of substance abuse that surround it. And then Charlie Sheen said something that no headline repeated as often as it should have. He described the moment he received the diagnosis. He said, "They gave me a handful of pills and said, 'You can go home now, and you are going to live. You are going to live.'" That sentence, 4 words, spoken by a doctor to a man sitting alone with the worst news of his life, is the sentence that everything else in this story orbits around. Because what comes before it is the fall, the excess, the chaos, the spectacular and very public destruction of a career and 2 marriages and a reputation that had once been genuinely considerable. And what comes after it is the question of what a man does when he has been told, against the evidence of his own behavior, that he is going to live. The revelation was not without its complications. Multiple women came forward in the period following the announcement with legal claims alleging that Sheen had not disclosed his HIV status to them during sexual encounters. In August of 2022, Sheen paid a settlement of $120,000 to a former girlfriend who alleged that he had deliberately exposed her to the virus without her knowledge. Sheen did not admit responsibility in that settlement. There were other settlements, other legal proceedings, other allegations that resulted in agreements whose terms remained private, but whose existence was a matter of public record. These are not minor details. They are part of this story in the same way that the diagnosis itself is part of this story, as facts that sit alongside the other facts, that complicate the portrait without erasing it, that demand to be acknowledged rather than softened into something more comfortable. Charlie Sheen has never offered a full public accounting of those years and those decisions. The documentary aka Charlie Sheen, released in September of 2025, was criticized by reviewers precisely because it did not press hard enough on these questions, because it allowed the man at its center to narrate his own story without sufficient challenge from the people who experienced that story from a different position. That criticism is legitimate. It lives in this story because the truth lives in this story, even when the truth is inconvenient for the arc of redemption that the rest of the narrative seems to be building toward. What is also true is this. A man sat down on live television in November of 2015 and said something that he had every financial and personal incentive to never say. He said it in front of millions of people. He said it in the specific, irreversible way that things said on live television are said, with no edit, no second take, no publicist's carefully worded statement to soften the landing. He said, "I am in fact HIV positive." And then he went home, and the question of what he was going to do next, with the diagnosis, with the sobriety he had not yet found, with the children who were watching, with the decades of damage that still needed to be accounted for, that question was still entirely open. The answer to that question did not arrive until December of 2017, and when it arrived quietly, without cameras, without a tour or a memoir or a Netflix documentary. It arrived as a decision made in private by a man who had finally run out of alternatives. There is no footage of the moment Charlie Sheen got sober. No camera crew was present. No publicist issued a statement. No tour was announced. The man who had conducted the most public meltdown in the history of American celebrity made the most important decision of his life in complete silence. And the world did not notice, because the world had largely moved on to the next spectacle and the next name and the next carefully documented collapse. December of 2017. That is the month he identifies as the beginning of something different. Not a rehabilitation visit. Not a court-mandated program. Not a temporary correction followed by a return to the same patterns that had governed his life for the better part of 3 decades. Something that held. Something that, as of July of 2026, has held for 8.5 years. He has spoken about it in the particular language of someone who has been inside the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous long enough to understand what those rooms can and cannot do. He said, "When I finally decided that I was going to make AA a place that I passed through and not wound up in, that is when I felt like I was the captain of my own ship." That distinction between passing through and winding up is not a small one. It is the difference between treatment as a destination and treatment as a tool, between understanding sobriety as a finish line and understanding it as the condition under which everything else becomes possible. What sobriety revealed, once the noise stopped, was a life that required genuine reconstruction at almost every level. The financial picture was not what it had been. The $1,800,000 per episode had not translated into the kind of preserved, protected wealth that those numbers might suggest to someone observing from the outside. There were the divorces, 2 of them, both expensive and both legally complicated in ways that continued to generate obligations years after the marriages themselves had ended. There were the settlements, the legal fees, The years of excess that had been financed at a rate that even $1,800,000 per episode could not sustain indefinitely. In July of 2026, court documents confirmed that Charlie Sheen had agreed to pay his former wife, Brooke Mueller, $500,000 in owed child support for their twin sons, Bob and Max, covering obligations that stretched from March of 2011 to July of 2026. 15 years of a legal and financial relationship with a woman he had divorced before his sobriety began. Still producing obligations, still requiring navigation, still present in his life in the concrete and unavoidable way that children make their parents permanently connected, regardless of what the marriage ultimately became. The twins are 16 years old. His daughters, Sam and Lola, from his marriage to Denise Richards, are 21 and 20 respectively. His eldest child, Cassandra Estevez, born from a relationship in 1984 when Sheen was still a teenager, is in her 40s. He is, at 60, a man with children spread across 4 decades of his life. Each of them a record of a different chapter, a different version of the man their father was trying to be at the moment they arrived. His daughter, Sammy Sheen, who has built her own public presence in the years since, has spoken about the moment she learned the real reason her father decided to get sober. She had an emotional reaction. The details of what she was told and what moved her remain private. But the fact of that reaction, the fact that a daughter was affected by understanding what had finally reached her father at the end of 2017, speaks to something that the public story of Charlie Sheen tends to obscure. Behind the tour and the catchphrases and the settlements and the documentaries, there are children. There are people who did not choose to be part of this story and who are part of it anyway, permanently and completely, in the way that families are. John Cryer, who spent 8 seasons playing Alan Harper alongside Charlie Sheen's Charlie Harper, who was present for the entirety of the show's greatest years, who watched from a closer distance than almost anyone the slow escalation and eventual collapse, revealed in the period following the documentary's release that he had not spoken to Charlie Sheen in years. That silence between 2 men who spent a decade working together, who built something significant together, who were in some meaningful sense professionally inseparable for the best years of both their careers, that silence is its own kind of statement. It does not require interpretation. It simply sits there, factual and sad, as evidence that some things that break do not reassemble themselves just because time has passed and decisions have changed. Sobriety does not repair everything. That is not what it promises and not what it delivers. What it delivers, what Charlie Sheen has described it as delivering, is clarity. The ability to see the damage accurately, without the distortion that substances impose on perception. The ability to be present for the people who are still there. The ability to be, in his own words, the captain of his own ship. He said in 2023, when asked about his sobriety, "Next month, I will be 6 years sober. I have a very consistent lifestyle now. A very consistent lifestyle." For a man whose lifestyle had been, for the better part of 2 decades, the most visible example of inconsistency that American celebrity culture could produce, that sentence is not a small achievement. It is, in the specific language of recovery, everything. The antiretroviral medication continues. His viral load remains undetectable. His doctors have confirmed that his HIV is managed, that his immune system is functioning, that the diagnosis that might have been a death sentence in another era is, in this one, a condition that he lives with rather than one that is ending his life. He has described the medication as something he takes every day, without exception, as reliably as anything else in the very consistent lifestyle he has built from the wreckage of the years before. He is not the man he was in 2011. He is not the man he was in 2015. He is not entirely certain yet what man he is at 60, which is, perhaps, the most honest thing a person can say at the beginning of a decade they genuinely did not expect to reach. And in September of 2025, sitting in front of Andrew Renzi's camera for the Netflix documentary that would divide critics and generate the kind of conversation that his name has always generated, he found the word for it. Not a comeback, a reset. There is a version of this story that ends cleanly. The man hits bottom, finds sobriety, makes peace with his past, reconciles with the people he hurt, and walks into the final chapter of his life with the kind of grace that redemption narratives require. That version is satisfying. It is also, in the case of Charlie Sheen, not entirely accurate. The truth is messier and more human than that. The court documents are still being filed. The child support obligations are still being calculated and settled and renegotiated. John Cryer is still not speaking to him. The critics of the Netflix documentary are still pointing, with legitimate force, to the questions it did not answer and the people it did not adequately center. The women who came forward with legal claims are still part of this story, whether the documentary acknowledged them fully or not. And Charlie Sheen, at 60, is still figuring it out. He said, in the promotional period around the documentary's release in September of 2025. Something that landed differently than the winning vocabulary of 2011. He said, "I am not calling all of this a comeback. I am calling it a reset. I am just living for the next moment, whatever that turns out to be. Living for the next moment." For a man who spent years living at a velocity that made the present moment almost impossible to inhabit, who was always in the excess of the current thing or the wreckage of the last thing with very little space between them. That sentence represents a genuine shift in orientation. Not toward the past, where the accounting is unfinished and uncomfortable. Not toward a future that is being aggressively projected and performed. Toward the next moment, whatever that turns out to be. When journalists approached him in April of 2026 with questions about his health and his finances, he responded with a phrase that contained, in its compression, something of the old Charlie Sheen, the one who could deflect with wit when he chose to. He said, "My presence answers." He was there. He was standing. He was present and accounted for in a way that, given the trajectory of the previous 15 years, was not guaranteed and should not be taken for granted. His father, Martin Sheen, Ramon Estevez, the man whose artistic ambition and Catholic faith shaped the household where Carlos Erwin Estevez first learned what it meant to tell stories, is still alive at 84. The relationship between a father who has watched his son almost destroy himself and the son who has spent 60 years inside the particular pressure of being Martin Sheen's child is not something that either man has fully narrated in public. But it is there, underneath everything, the way origins always are, present in the name Charlie chose not to carry, and present in the craft he clearly inherited, and present in the simple fact that Martin Sheen is one of the people who showed up for 7 documented interventions and kept showing up even when showing up produced no visible result. That is its own kind of love story. Not a romantic one, not a simple one, but a durable one, which, in the context of this particular life, is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. Charlie Sheen is 60 years old. He has 5 children across 4 decades. He has been sober for 8.5 years. He carries a virus that he manages daily with medication that keeps it undetectable. He has paid settlements whose totals, accumulated across years of legal proceedings, represent a financial reckoning that his most spectacular earning years could not fully absorb. He has made a documentary that some people found honest and others found insufficient. He has written a memoir. He has said the word reset in public and apparently meant it. He is not the legend he might have been. The one that Platoon and Wall Street seemed to be announcing in 1986 and 1987, when he was 21 years old, and the whole of American cinema seemed to be arranging itself around him. That version of Charlie Sheen did not survive the decades that followed. It could not have. The same qualities that made him extraordinary on screen, the appetite, the intensity, the refusal to modulate, made that particular future impossible. But he is here, at 60, sober, present, still navigating the obligations and the distances and the silences that the years of excess created and that sobriety alone cannot dissolve. Still taking the medication. Still living, as he said, for the next moment. Whatever that turns out to be. There is a kind of courage in that which is easy to miss if you are looking for the more dramatic variety. The courage of the comeback speech. The courage of the grand gesture. The courage that photographs well and generates the kind of clip that gets shared. The courage of the very consistent lifestyle is quieter than that. It does not announce itself. It simply continues, day after day, in the specific and unglamorous way that recovery actually works for the people who are doing it rather than performing it. He was the highest-paid actor in American television history. He stood in Oliver Stone's Mud and Fire and helped make one of the defining films of his generation. He made 30 million people laugh every week for 8 years by playing a version of himself so convincing that the line between character and man eventually disappeared entirely. He lost the job and the marriages and the reputation, and almost, in ways that were not always visible to the cameras, the life itself. And then he did the quietest and most difficult thing that any of it required. He stopped. He stayed, stopped, and he is still here. Leave a tribute in the comments for Charlie Sheen, a man who has given this story everything it has, including the parts he would probably rather keep private, and who is at 60 still working out what the rest of it means. What does it take to fall that far and still be standing? And what does standing look like when the crowd has moved on and the cameras are smaller and the only person keeping score is the one looking back at you in the mirror every morning? If this story moved you, if the life of Charlie Sheen has made you think differently about what fame costs and what recovery looks like from the inside, subscribe to Golden Fame News. There are more stories here. There are always more stories.